I always say to my students, I'm a failed actor, therefore I can project my voice. Those were two very, very interesting presentations, really, because I think the first presentation really begs the question, how? I think the second presentation gives us an indication of a possible way how, the referendum. I'm going to really address, I guess, what I would regard as the real world, because I don't actually think the referendum to get out, not to get out of the mess we're in, will actually take off. I don't think that there is any appetite. There might be appetite in movements like our own here, but I don't think there's any appetite in Parliament, certainly not in the leadership of the Labour Party. There might be in the Liberal Party, but I'm not so sure the Conservatives either, regardless of whether they are Remainers or Brexiteers. So I don't think that's going to happen. I actually think that under certain circumstances, and I'll talk about that in a moment, the only realistic prospect, both political and legal, to actually not ditch Brexit immediately, but to actually halt the process and call time on it for a while, is actually through the Article 50 third sentence process. In other words, Article 50, yes, talks about you can withdraw, it talks about the constitutional arrangements internally, it talks about the procedures within the Union for getting out. In the third sentence, of course, it talks about states suddenly waking up one morning and realizing that actually, for a variety of reasons, they want to stop the clock. Right? And basically, the third sentence says that once you've notified, you've basically got 2 years and you're out. Unless, and the key words are, unless the European Council, in agreement with the member state concerned, unanimously decides to extend this period. Now, in my view, given the mess we're in, and there is no doubt that the government basically is blocked, right? The only way forward to avoid the calamity that I think is basically the Titanic, we've seen what's coming. Will the captains of the ship unblock their little ideas and change things? But I'll come back to that in a moment. So, in my view, this is the only way. I guess I've got to come up with 5 reasons, but I've been formed in the French school, and really, in France we only think about, I'm Italian by the way, but my wife is French, so we always think in 3s. In France there are always 3 reasons, not 5. 5 is too many. It's too Anglo-Saxon. But anyway, I've tried to come up with 5 interconnected reasons why I think Article 53 in brackets is a realistic prospect. And I'll come back to the fundamental condition in a moment. Why is it realistic? Well, I've just given you one reason. The government's blocked. We're running out of time. We don't know what we're doing. And even though the Prime Minister may tell us that we're going to stick to the timetable, we are leaving on the 29th of March at 11 o'clock at night, the reality is that we don't have a withdrawal agreement yet, and we haven't even started to talk about the political declaration, which the government says is going to be really detailed, that can be turned into a treaty overnight. The political declaration that basically deals with our future relationship. Now, don't underestimate that political declaration. That's fundamental. If you like, the transition, which is mistake number 2, and reason number 2 why 53 is important. The truth is, I can take back 20 seconds, can't I? The reason why the political declaration is important is because it is the only serious way that we can actually see what we are transiting to. Otherwise, what are we transiting to? We call it implementation. On the continent, they call it transition. But what actually are we transitioning to? Well, actually, the political declaration and the framework should tell us. And until that's clarified and agreed, we know what the Europeans, what the EU27 want. They've told us. We have guidelines, negotiating guidelines. Do we have any? No. Do we have a white paper? Well, we were going to get a white paper, but now we can't agree on the white paper. So I think somebody cracked a joke that it would be that. Knowing David Davis, I don't know whether you mentioned it or somebody else, but just like the analyses of the impact that had been thorough and well worked through, and we discovered that actually they hadn't been so worked out, so worked through, we will now discover that the white paper is literally that, one sheet of white paper. That's what he'll claim in May. So, time. We really have run out of time. And there's a domestic dimension to that as well. How, in God's name, heaven forgive me, would we be able to negotiate the agreement in the time by the end of October at the very latest, by the way, and then translate that into primary domestic legislation, because that has to be enacted on the day we leave in order to give effect. So realistically, unless it's an incredibly botched job, or the civil servants and the ministers running this show in the Ministry of Brexit, whatever it calls itself, I just don't see it. And I think the government is gradually beginning to see it. I think Mrs. May is probably beginning to see it. Those of you who may have witnessed her performance today on Question Time, when she could not answer, she answered one question. We are going to leave on the 29th of March, and our transition period will end on the 31st of December. Big deal. It is, but remember, now I'm thinking a little bit like a boring lawyer, we plan to. Plan to does not necessarily mean we will. So, time is reason number one. Reason number two, I've already alluded to it. The transition was a mistake. And I think it bought the government a little bit of time, but it was a mistake. And that's linked to another reason. Transition, fine, but transition means that we leave. That's the agreement. Basically, the transition period is from outside the European Union, not inside. Okay? That's, I think, a realization. Actually, that was a Labour invention. It was Keir Starmer who must have dreamt about it and came up with that idea, because it seemed a good whiz of actually putting the inevitable, or what seemed the inevitable, further away, so that they could persuade Corbyn to basically gradually, as he has done, see the sense of actually perhaps, he's come up with the idea of negotiating a new customs union. Fine. It'll be different, but it'll be the same. And of course, very interestingly, though some people in the Labour Party are saying this is sabotage. He's trying to get, he's going to support May by sabotaging what the Lords did. I don't agree, actually. I don't think it's a sabotage at all. I think there are problems with what the House of Lords did in basically saying that, if the worst comes to the worst, we must join the EEA, as if the EEA want to embrace us. But, transition, a mistake. Third reason, the Irish border question, which I think we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. Well, the Irish border question is actually the bridge between the withdrawal agreement and the future framework. The Irish border question, the UK government is stuck, and even if it comes up with a proposal, that proposal, the technology for it, whether it's the max FAC or whether the other one, the customs partnership, we won't have the technological means to basically deliver that. Because remember, under the government's plans, we are leaving the customs union and we are leaving the single market. So you need to develop the technological means to avoid a border. It's cloud cuckoo land, really, but still, that pushes potentially the transition period until some people have suggested 2023. So we will be requesting an extension on the extension, even though that's denied. In the meantime, and this is where it becomes a little bit convoluted, in the meantime, of course, there's a challenge for the government. Do we maintain the backstop position vis-à-vis Ireland? In other words, that those horrid Europeans wrote in the draft withdrawal treaty to say, well, actually, you're going to end up with a united Ireland, common regulatory area, the Irish Sea becomes the new frontier. Of course, the government can't wear that for constitutional, but more importantly, perhaps for political reasons. Why? Because if they dared stick to that position, the DUP would dump them immediately, because it would basically mean that Northern Ireland was being detached from the rest of the United Kingdom. So fundamentally, the government would have to, and it is trying to renegotiate the position, and in my view, and the government's already, if you read some of the statements made by Davis and others in front of the Exit Committee in the House of Commons, they're basically saying, well, we're going to that's off the table. Basically, backstop equals remaining in the customs union and in the internal market until we worked out the technological means. And this leads to the fourth reason why I think Article 53 is very important. Consequence. We had a referendum in 2016, I believe. I don't remember the morning of the 6th. I was too depressed and I shut the world out because I knew we were going to lose at about 11 o'clock that night. 2016, the referendum. Okay? 2019, we're going to leave. If I think I'm adding up correctly. 2023, possibility that we will finally leave. Consequence, and this is a very important consequence. From March 2019, if we go down the transition route, from March 2019 until sometime in 2023, 4 years, roundabout, we will. One of the conditions of the transition, of course, is that we're out, but we are subject to the rules. And we continue to pay into the budget, of course. It would mean that for 4 years, we would be rule takers. I'd like to see any government, frankly, sell that to any electorate. By the way, it's okay, we're out. However, we're still subject to the rules. It would make dear old Rees-Mogg look like a genius. And he's not. Don't be fooled, they're not geniuses. We would genuinely be like a vassal state. Rule takers, not rule makers. Right? Now, I don't know whether the Prime Minister and part of her camp, but it's a bloc government, so I don't actually see it happening, whether they could possibly deliver that electorally. And finally, because have I spoken too long? Sorry. Finally, I guess it needs to be invoked. We need to stop the process for some of the reasons that I've talked about, because fundamentally it is the only way of ensuring that we do not lose our representation in EU institutions that actually will continue to take decisions that affect all our lives. Finally, I have to say that this is a work of fantasy, and it will only become real if on June the 12th, that's next week, very important day, it will go down in history. This kind of thing will only happen if the government basically ceases to be the government.
Yes.
Right? And that will only happen if they lose one or two very important votes next week. Right? Because then, with an election, and I don't doubt it for 1 minute, a change of government, not necessarily a one-party government, then I think the window would open for the new government coming in to say, stop the clock. Right? But anyway, thank you very much. I hope that